make 3 points about it. One, that it is very old. Two, that it is very new. And three, that it's very complex. And to illustrate how old it was, and I always thought it was only about 2,000 years old or 2,500 years old. But I was pleased to discover, Ramesh, after reading your book, that it's actually 4,500 years old. The oldest diplomatic instrument was a cuneiform tablet that was found. And that's how old it is. It's a remarkable how far back it goes. And it's also remarkable how it sort of arose spontaneously in different cultures. I mean, we all know about what the Romans and the Greeks, because so much has been written about them. But in India, in China, similar forms evolve also. And as you know, all the kingdoms and all discovered that diplomacy is absolutely essential, because you have to talk to each other, you have to send envoys to each other's countries, and if you want to send envoys to each other's countries, the first thing the envoy is going to be assured of is that his head will not be chopped off. And that's the concept of diplomatic impunity. That's immunity, and that's where it came from. To ensure that envoys could go and talk to hostile states and come back and not have their heads chopped off. Now, given the sort of classical need for diplomats to be able to talk to enemies, and they figured this out 3,000 years ago, one of the most striking irregularities of our time is the belief in some countries, and to give you an obvious example, take the United States of America. Many people in the United States Congress actually believe that the establishment of diplomatic relations is a gesture that you are a friend of mine. Actually, you don't need diplomatic relations with friends. You need diplomatic relations with enemies. And so logically, if Iran is an enemy of the United States of America, or if North Korea is an enemy of the United States of America, the logical thing you would have done 3,000 years ago would have been to establish diplomatic relations. And it's strange what they could do 3,000 years ago, we can't do today. And that's why it's really important to have a book like this to remind us what's the wisdom of the past that we need to apply. But at the same time, as I said, it's also very new. It's also very new because diplomacy, the size of the industry, has grown by leaps and bounds. I mean, in the past, you basically had diplomats talking to each other in bilateral relationships, and I'm glad we have a very distinguished corps of ambassadors here with us who can confirm this. But increasingly, the industry has grown so big that diplomats spend half the time, more than half the time, attending thousands of international conferences on all kinds of subjects. So the scale has grown dramatically, and his need has grown dramatically. So all this brings me to my third point about its complexity, because it is actually becoming, in many ways, a much more difficult game to play. And why do I say it's a more difficult game to play? And the best way to illustrate this point is to look at three contemporary examples of global challenges where we actually agree on the end goal. But even though there's almost near unanimous agreement on the end goal, we cannot get there. And what are these three examples of global challenges? One, of course, is climate change. I mean, we all agree that it will be a disaster for 7 billion people on this earth if global warming happens, and we almost literally fry our planet, and we have nowhere else to go. If planet A fails, we have no planet B. The logical thing we should be doing is therefore rushing into an agreement on climate change. But trust me, it will not happen, because it's very difficult and very complex exercise to find a formula that works for everybody. Secondly, we all agree It's insane to have so many nuclear weapons. We actually have the capacity to destroy humanity several times over. In principle, everyone agrees they could be reduced. In fact, that's why George Shultz and Sam Nunn and Bill Perry were coming to Singapore today and tomorrow to reaffirm the need to reduce nuclear arsenals. Again, as you saw, in terms of the reaction to President Obama's speech last week in Berlin. He gave a great speech, no results. We agree on the goals, but we can't get it done. And thirdly, of course, pandemics. As you know, right now we worry about the haze, but Singapore's gone through SARS before. We should be worrying about what we can do to reduce threats from pandemics, and therefore we should be strengthening the World Health Organization, giving it more money. Instead, we're doing the exact opposite. I give you these three examples of global challenges where we agree upon the goals, and yet we can't do it, to illustrate why diplomacy, frankly, even though it's 4,500 years old, is still a sunrise industry. And therefore, Ramesh, congratulations on producing this book.
All my life, I've been told by generals that words can never stop bullets. I was determined to prove them wrong. Why did we do the book, my co-editors and myself? It is the three themes that Kishore gave you. Because diplomacy is a very old profession. It's a very new profession. And it's very complex and challenging. The age Kishore has gone through, it's changing in very interesting ways now. In terms of the issues, in terms of the actors and stakeholders, in terms of the challenges, with respect to the tools. And through all these changes, the profession has become, in our view, more important and more critical, not less so. Because the consequences in today's world of failing to utilize diplomacy and resolving issues through diplomatic means are going to be catastrophic. Not the least for reasons of nuclear issues, which I want to be my main theme. But the surprising thing is the number of countries where the ministry is being thinned out and hollowed out. Not everywhere. Brazil is a good example of where they've expanded missions and expanded intake. But I find it astonishing that a country with a rising profile and size and weight like India should have a total foreign service of just 600 people. It is beyond comprehension how they can manage with that. So it is important. And Kishore mentioned the three issues. I won't talk about climate change, but let me just talk about the nuclear issue. And I want to marry that to the other thing that Kishore mentioned. I was a commissioner on the Responsibility to Protect Commission. Gareth was co-chair. Gareth and I wrote the report where we married the notion of sovereignty as a responsibility to the protection agenda. Legal protection agenda for the moment, but sovereignty as responsibility certainly applies to the problem of the haze. It certainly applies to nuclear issues. It applies to financial crises. In the sense that if your actions have extraterritorial consequences well beyond your borders, in particular if they have systemic consequences, then sovereignty as privilege and exclusive control within borders is no longer relevant. In fact, it has to be exercised with due responsibility to the world, to your neighbors, to the international community. And the international community has a right to hold you to that responsibility on these issues. But, of course, it is better if that is done by diplomatic means, following diplomatic procedures and channels as well. With respect to actors and sites, again, think of the nuclear issue. The centerpiece is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, indefinitely and permanently extended in 1995, under the presidency and chair of Jayanta Thanapala, whose chapter is a case study on that very issue from 95. It meets every 5 years at the review conferences, which are preceded by various preparatory committee meetings, including one we had in Geneva in April this year. It has come up periodically with certain action points and recommendations as an intergovernmental body. In addition, we have had 2 nuclear security summits, and the third will be held next year. An example of summit diplomacy, on which we have a very good chapter from Paul Martin, the former Prime Minister of Canada, writing on the G20. Summits are made necessary because of the facts of globalization and interdependence, including pandemics and environmental issues and other issues. They are made possible by the advances in transportation and telecommunications, where leaders can now get together. We don't want leaders to be overburdened, and therefore the agenda has to pass a pay grade test. Only those issues that are necessary for leaders to tackle directly should be handled there. Once summits are called, it affects the dynamics of the negotiations before the summit within national bureaucracies, because leaders don't like to meet at summits and have no obvious failure. So it's a useful way of breaking down veto points. At the summit, leaders can engage in trading apples for oranges in a way in which particular portfolio cabinet ministers cannot do, who will trade oranges for oranges but not across the thing. And after the summit, if leaders have signed on to something, it is a wonderful exercise and discipline for mobilizing additional resources and ensuring commitment from the various political and bureaucratic actors within the thing as well. So the Security Summit as an example of summit diplomacy. But of course we've also had any number of international blue ribbon commissions on the nuclear issue, including the Canberra Commission, the Blix Commission, the Tokyo Forum, and most recently the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the RCND. And the chapter on commission diplomacy as a feature of contemporary diplomacy is written by none other than Gareth Evans, who set up some as foreign minister, who's been a member of several, and has co-chaired at least 2 very influential international commissions. So that's another feature in today's diplomatic landscape, commission diplomacy. But ICNNT also recommended the establishment of a center, a new center, to monitor states' compliance with action points and agreed agenda outcomes, and with authoritative recommendations. That's how my center came to be formed. So we have in today's world civil society and NGOs as actors in the diplomatic sphere who engage in advocacy, who engage in high quality research, who act as pressure points, and who can monitor state compliance in a way that is very difficult for the intergovernmental machinery itself to do. And national diplomats in this world have to operate in the context of a growing numbers and visibility and importance of multilateral diplomacy. And of course, Kishore is a wonderful person to have to write a chapter on the very feature of multilateral diplomacy. But in addition to this, if you go back to the nuclear security summits, the premise for that is a nuclear vulnerability and incident anywhere in the world can be a threat to every country in the world or to any other country in the world. And terrorists will not target the country that has the most weapons, nuclear weapons. They will target the country that has the most vulnerable nuclear weapons, with the goal of using it not in that country but anywhere else in the world against their favorite target of choice. And that's why it's no longer a matter of sovereign responsibility. But the fact that we responded to the challenges of the time in 2001 and came up with the responsibility to protect formulation as a new normative architecture for dealing with the protection issue, in turn created fresh challenges for diplomats in how to implement that and to do so in a way that is sensitive to legitimate concerns and yet serves the protection. So these are just some of the issues, and just a brief glimpse of the changing context in which this second oldest profession carries on an even more critical task, success in which will ensure the survival of the planet and something to look forward to for our descendants several generations hence. I would encourage you to leaf through the book. I don't expect you to have to read the entire book, but I hope it will be useful to you for an entire professional lifetime as a source of reference in a way that doesn't exist or had not existed before we produced the book. Thank you very much.
Accepted with alacrity, partly because of the company that I would join, but also because of the subject matter, as has already been made clear. Diplomacy is both an old but also an evolving and incredibly important profession. And for an international lawyer, this is perhaps clearer than for most. In recent days, many international lawyers like myself have been asked, what can you do about the Hayes situation? And the Minister may refer to this later, but he's been, I think, admirably clear about the possibilities but also the limitations of international law in such a situation. Basically, there are three problems to dealing with what is clearly a failure of governance on the part of Indonesia, which I can say, which he could not say. And the three problems are, firstly, identifying a wrong. Arguably, the transboundary effects of the Hayes constitute an international wrong. But secondly, is this in fact attributable to the Indonesian government? And that is in fact an open question. Indonesia has law on the books prohibiting the use of fire in the way that it's being used at the moment, but arguably is not enforcing that as robustly as it could have. But then the third problem is that even if you could prove that there was a wrong taking place, even if you could prove that there was in fact, it was attributable to the Indonesian government, what do you then do? There's no international forum in which Singapore could bring Indonesia without Indonesia's consent, and there's no enforcement mechanism. And so you fall back on diplomacy, moral suasion, political suasion, and other perhaps more creative legal techniques such as looking at what can happen within individual jurisdictions, and there's discussion about what can happen within Singapore, to Singapore-listed companies, for example. So all of this to say that diplomacy is an incredibly important institution, but it's a problematic institution. The fundamental problem that Kishore identified is that we don't know enough about it. And this book, which has already been highlighted as a weighty tome in many senses, books like this are unlikely to be unput-downable, but we hope this is not unpick-upable. I think Kishore has highlighted some of the collective action problems that we confront in his three parts. Ramesh has highlighted his own three areas of misfortune. Being a mere law professor, I'll only give you 2 points, which are two strategic challenges to diplomacy now, where things that were long taken for granted in the 4,000-year-plus history of diplomacy are now being called into question. And those two things are, first, that diplomacy is about relations between states, and secondly, that confidential communications between those states could be kept secret. And both of these presumptions have been called into question of late. So first, the idea that diplomacy is about the relation between states. One of the most interesting ideas in the book is that diplomacy is moving from club diplomacy to network diplomacy. And this is something that Ramesh was discussing about the proliferation of institutions where diplomats interact. But there's also a proliferation of actors. So it's not just representatives of states, it's representatives of international organisations, increasingly representatives of non-governmental organisations exercising quasi-diplomatic functions, and on occasion being granted quasi-diplomatic status. And in my own chapter on the book, looking at evolving institutions that aren't quite states. So I talk in the book about peace building and post-conflict reconstruction, that the creation of institutions of a state, such as Kosovo, which remains in a kind of limbo status, or Timor-Leste, which has now become a fully fledged state, but for almost 3 years existed in an odd status of being an international territory administered by the United Nations. And so you had UN officials carrying out the function of being cabinet ministers, and you had a UN special representative, the Secretary General, who, as his counterpart in Kosovo did, had essentially the power of law in those two territories of Kosovo and Timor-Leste. So I was very interested in this from a legal perspective and what this meant for the practice of diplomacy. And without getting too much into the legal question, I'll just give you some of the tactical and the strategic questions that this rose for the diplomats, that this gave rise to for the diplomats in question. Tactically, it became difficult just to coordinate the proliferation of actors you had to deal with. This is no longer just a matter of the relations between various states, but the states had to coordinate with international institutions and the NGOs, and the problematic relationship with the local nationals, the people who clearly would ultimately be in charge, and technically should have ownership of the territory that they were going to inherit. But of course there was a reason why there was an international presence in the first place. So one couldn't simply defer to local institutions, because the very reason there was an international presence was either, in the case of Kosovo, those institutions could not be trusted to govern in an appropriate way, representing all of the people, or in the case of Timor-Leste, you had a lack of local capacity, at least for the time being. So those are some of the tactical questions. The strategic questions are, what should these international actors do? How should they carry out their function? How do you hand over, how do you create the institutions of the state, some kind of functioning democratic institutions, through what is essentially dictatorial control by a bunch of people with diplomatic immunity? And I can save you the time of reading my own book on this, just by telling you the title, You, the People. What sense does it make to try and foist democracy on a population through what, on an uncharitable lens, could be regarded as military occupation, which is essentially what Kosovo for a long time existed under and Timor-Leste did for a while. So these are some of the challenges in terms of our presumption that diplomacy is about relations between states. A second challenge these days, very much in the news, is the difficulty of keeping anything secret these days. If you can't trust people like Edward Snowden, who can you trust? It's now a year that Julian Assange has been hiding out in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and in his effort perhaps to spin things off into the movie rights, Edward Snowden, having landed in Moscow recently, in case you missed that, is now talking about seeking political asylum in Ecuador also. It's going to make a great movie, I think. All of this makes life very difficult for the diplomats. It was about 250 years ago that Voltaire famously observed that if a diplomat says yes, he or she means perhaps. If a diplomat says perhaps, he or she means no. And if he or she says no, then he's not a diplomat. I shouldn't say that. There is a completely inappropriate reference that then goes on to women, which I'm not going to go into, that is often quoted in the same breath. But what Voltaire was pointing to is the need for discretion. And discretion becomes very difficult if you can't rely on your conversations being kept confidential. And this was the real difficulty posed by the WikiLeaks release of the massive amount of cables from the US State Department, that it revealed all sorts of confidences. Many ambassadors were embarrassed. Some were recalled from their posts, although personally I thought the most ironic person who lost his job was the Director General of Al Jazeera News, was one of the people who lost his job. But what was to me interesting was the misguided assumption on the part of Assange and colleagues that all of this would lead to more transparency, that by giving information to the public this was inherently a good thing. In general, I agree, transparency is a good thing in terms of the way in which decisions are to be made, the way in which processes are run, the way in which powers are exercised. And I've argued that in regard to, among other things, the institutions of surveillance recently. But transparency is not a good way to encourage a free discussion of ideas when decisions are being made. And so perversely, there's some evidence that the consequence of the WikiLeaks release of cables, now perhaps being reinforced by the fact that the NSA can't keep secrets, is not that you will see greater transparency, that you will see less transparency. Because diplomats are now much more careful about what they will commit to writing. Meetings take place orally without written records, and so you'll have actually less transparency and worse decisions. So these are some of the current challenges for diplomacy, but I'll end it there so that we've got time for the question and answer and the discussion to come. Thank you all very much.
Confidential and sacred. Singapore's own position, I mean, everyone knows about our geography and our limitations, and we always take the view that we are intrinsically relevant in international relations. And we have to create our own relevance and meaning to our existence to the rest of the world. And if we are relevant today, and I think we are, it is really due to the hard work of the people that come before, certainly before me, before us, and many some of whom are sitting in this audience, really created a framework and a structure for Singapore to stand out in the field of diplomacy in international relationships, such that when I go to the United Nations, we have about 35 countries which want to meet us. And the first time I went, I scratched my head and said, why do so many countries want to meet us? It's because we are successful, we are relevant, and we have made ourselves relevant. That's really the art of diplomacy. For bigger countries, these are not essential questions. And we have had to therefore have an astute understanding of the constantly evolving external environment, and we will continue to work at that. And for that, we certainly need the best possible expertise, keep our finger on the pulse of the international system and the region, and not be taken by surprise. This book is therefore timely for us in that context. It has assembled renowned practitioners, thinkers in the fields of diplomacy, international relations, to contribute to our understanding of change and continuity, and has highlighted the changing trends in the international system. In particular, I will certainly place close attention to the following chapters. Chapter 4 on the political actors, Chapter 5 on the bureaucracy, and Chapter 6 on the modern mission, or modern diplomatic mission. And really, what are the best practices we can learn from others. This handbook is more than an academic treatise. It provides an indicative list of the tools and competencies that diplomats of this milieu need to be equipped with. It also includes useful case studies to drive home the complexities of the conduct of diplomacy. And it's an important literature for future generations of diplomats and foreign policy experts. To my colleagues in attendance, I would like to thank you for your hard work, remind you to brace ourselves for the new challenges that will come our way. Let me congratulate once again the authors, contributors of the handbook. Wish it every success. Thank you.